when it's you who were the cause of it all, refusing to come to my party and turning them all against me." He knew that what he was saying was unjust. He admitted to himself the truth of all that the savage now said about the worthlessness of friends who could be turned by such slight causes into cruel enemies. But Bernard continued to feel a secret anger with the savage in spite of the real affection that he had for him. Bernard's other friend was Helmholtz Watson, suffering like himself because of his individual, non-conditioned ideas. Helmholtz had been officially warned that some verses that he had written and read out to a class of students at the College of Emotional Engineering were dangerous and must not be repeated. The verses were in praise of silence, of the state of being alone and able to enjoy one's own thoughts and feelings. The students had reported him to the principal. "I'm not surprised," said Bernard. "It's quite against all their sleep teaching. Remember, they've had at least 250,000 warnings against wanting to be alone." "I know, but I thought I'd like to see what the effect would be." "Well, you've seen now." Helmholtz laughed. "I feel," he said after a silence, "as though I were just beginning to have something to write about. As though I were just beginning to use that secret power that I've got inside me. Something seems to be coming to me." In spite of all his troubles, he seemed, Bernard thought, deeply happy. Helmholtz and the savage formed a liking for each other at once. Helmholtz read out the verses that had caused him to be warned by the principal. The savage replied by reading some lines from his old book that excited Helmholtz as he had never been excited before in his life. But Helmholtz simply could not understand the story of Romeo and Juliet when John read out the play to him with deep emotion, seeing himself all the time as Romeo and Lenina as Juliet. Helmholtz shouted with laughter at the idea of a father and mother, disgusting words anyway, forcing the daughter to have someone she didn't want, and the stupid girl not saying that she was having someone else whom, for the moment at any rate, she preferred. The situation was so dirty, and at the same time so funny, that Helmholtz laughed till the tears ran down his face in streams. The savage looked at him angrily, closed his book, got up from his chair, and locked it away in its drawer. "And yet," said Helmholtz, when, having got back breath enough to apologize, he managed to persuade the savage to listen to his explanations, "I know quite well that one needs mad, impossible situations like that. One can't write really well about anything else. Why was the old fellow such a wonderful propaganda writer? Because he had so many really strong feelings, so many strange ideas to get excited about. You've got to be hurt and upset. Otherwise, you can't think of the really good phrases, those that strike at the mind and the heart and live in the memory. But fathers and mothers, you can't expect me to be serious about fathers and mothers. And who's going to get excited about a boy having a girl or not having her?" The savage looked offended, but Helmholtz, who was looking thoughtfully at the door, saw nothing. "No," he decided, "it won't do. We need some other kind of madness, some other kind of emotion to take possession of our minds and become the master of our imagination. But what? Where can I find it?" He was silent. Then, shaking his head, "I don't know," he said at last. "I don't know." Chapter 12. Love and Hate. Henry Foster appeared at Lenina's side in the faint red light of the embryo store. "Like to come to the cinema this evening?" Lenina shook her head without speaking. Going out with someone else? It interested him to know which of his friends was being had by which other. Is it Bernard? He asked. She shook her head again. Henry noticed how tired she looked, even in that weak light. You're not feeling ill, are you? He asked in a rather worried voice, afraid that she might be suffering from one of the few remaining diseases. Once more, Lenina shook her head. Anyhow, you ought to go and see the doctor, said Henry. A doctor a day keeps all worries away, he added cheerfully, using a phrase that rarely failed to cheer people up. Oh, for Ford's sake, said Lenina, breaking her silence at last. Shut up! And she turned back to her workbench. A doctor indeed! She would have laughed if she hadn't been on the point of crying. No doctor could cure what was the matter with her. She sighed deeply. John, she whispered to herself. John. An hour later, in the changing room, Fanny was protesting loudly. But it's silly to let yourself get into a state like this. Very silly, she repeated. And what about? A man. One man. But he's the one I want. As though there weren't millions of other men in the world. But I don't want them. How can you know till you've tried? I have tried. But how many? Asked Fanny. 1? 2? Dozens, but it wasn't any good. Well, you must keep on trying, said Fanny. But meanwhile, don't think of him. I can't help it. Take Soma then. I do. Well, go on taking it. But in the intervals, I still like him. I shall always like him. Well, if that's the case, said Fanny with decision, why don't you just go and take him, whether he wants it or no? But he's so strange. All the more reason for being firm. It's all very well to say that. Don't let him go on being so silly. Act, said Fanny. Yes, act at once. Do it now. I daren't, said Lenina. Well, you've only got to take 1/2 gram of Soma first. And now I'm going to have my bath. She marched off towards the bathroom. The bell rang. The savage, who was impatiently waiting for Helmholtz to come so that he could tell him how he felt about Lenina, jumped up and ran to the door. I guessed it was you, Helmholtz, he shouted as he opened it. There in the entrance, in a white artificial cotton sailor suit and with a round white cap at a most attractive angle on her head, stood Lenina. Oh, said the savage, as though someone had struck him a heavy blow. 1/2 gram had been enough to make Lenina forget her fears. Hello, John, she said, smiling, and walked past him into the room. He closed the door and followed her. Lenina sat down. There was a long silence. You don't seem very glad to see me, John, she said at last. Not glad, cried the savage with deep feeling. Then he suddenly fell on his knees before her, took her hand and kissed it. I love you more than anything else in the world. Then why on earth didn't you say so before? And suddenly her arms were round his neck. He felt her soft lips against his own. You silly boy, she was saying. I wanted you so much. Sweet, sweet. And if you wanted me too, why didn't you? In that moment, he found himself thinking of the kisses in 3 weeks in a helicopter that he had found so shameless. Horror, horror, horror. He tried to free himself. Lenina took her arms away and stood up. He thought for a moment that she had understood how he felt, but he soon realized how mistaken he was, for in a moment Lenina had taken off her sailor suit. With nothing on but her shoes and socks and her smart white cap, which she was still wearing, she advanced towards him. "Darling, darling, if only you'd said so before." She held out her arms. But instead of also saying darling and holding out his arms, the savage backed away in terror, waving his hands at her as though he were trying to frighten away some dangerous animal. 4 steps back, and he could move no further, his back against the wall. "Sweet boy," said Lenina, laying her hands on his shoulders and pressing herself against him. "Put your arms round me. Kiss me." She closed her eyes and let her voice sink into a sleepy whisper. The savage caught her by the wrists, tore her hands from his shoulders, and pushed her roughly away at arm's length. "Ow! You're hurting me! Oh!" She was suddenly silent. Terror had made her forget the pain. Opening her eyes, she had seen his face. No, not his face. A crazy stranger's, pale, twisted, filled with some mad anger. She tried to understand what had brought this madness into his face, but failed completely. "What is the matter, John?" she whispered. He did not answer, but only stared into her face with those mad eyes. The hands that held her wrists were trembling. He breathed deeply and unevenly. His lips curled back from his teeth. "What is the matter?" she almost screamed. And as though woken by her cry, he caught her by the shoulders and shook her. "Whore!" he shouted. "Whore from hell!" "Oh, don't!" she begged him in a voice which trembled from the shaking. "Away with you!" He pushed her away with such force that she fell. "Go!" he shouted, standing over her threateningly. "Get out of my sight, or I'll kill you!" Lenina raised her arm to cover her face. "No, please don't, John. Don't hurt me." "Hurry up, quick!" One arm still raised and following all his movements with a fearful eye, she struggled to her feet and, still covering her head, she rushed into the bathroom. Outside, in the other room, the savage marched up and down in anger. "Whore!" he repeated to himself. "Disgusting whore!" "John," came a frightened voice from the bathroom. "Do you think I might have my clothes?" He picked up the pretty white blouse, the attractive sailor trousers. "Open!" he ordered, kicking the door. "No, I won't." "Then how do you expect me to give them to you?" "Push them through the little window over the door." He did what she suggested, then went on marching up and down. Lenina sat listening to the footsteps in the other room, wondering as she listened how long he was likely to go on pacing up and down like that, whether she would have to wait until he left the flat, or if it would be safe, after allowing his madness a reasonable time to die down, to open the bathroom door and try to escape. At that moment, the telephone bell rang in the other room. She heard the voice of the savage. "Hello? Yes? Yes, this is Mr. Savage speaking. What? Who's ill? Of course it interests me. But is it serious? Is she really bad? I'll go at once." "Not in her rooms anymore. Where has she been taken?" "Oh my God! What's the address?" 3 Park Lane. Is that it? 3? Thanks. Lenina heard the sound of the telephone being put back, then hurrying steps. A door shut loudly. There was silence. Had he really gone? With great care, she opened the door a quarter of an inch. looked through the crack, and, encouraged by the silence, put her head out. Finally moved as quietly as she could into the room, stood for a few seconds with strongly beating heart, listening, then rushed to the front door, opened, slipped through, banged it shut, ran. It was not till she was in the lift and actually going down that she began to feel safe. Chapter 13. Death. The Park Lane Hospital for the Dying was a 60-floor tower of bright yellow. As the savage stepped out of his taxicopter, a line of brightly coloured funeral helicopters rose from the roof and went off across the park, westwards on their way to the Slough crematorium. At the lift gates, an official gave him the information he required, and he dropped down to the 17th floor. The ward where Linda was lying was a large room, bright with sunshine and yellow paint, and contained 20 beds, all occupied. Linda was dying in company and with all modern conveniences. The air was continuously alive with happy tunes coming from loudspeakers. At the foot of every bed, facing the dying person who occupied it, was a television set. Television was left on like a running water tap from morning till night. "We try," said the nurse who met the savage at the door, "to create a thoroughly pleasant atmosphere here, something between a first-class hotel and a cinema palace, if you take my meaning." "Where is she?" asked the savage, taking no notice of these polite explanations. The nurse was offended. "You are in a hurry," she said. "Is there any hope?" he asked. "You mean of her not dying?" He nodded. "No, of course there isn't. When somebody's sent here, there's no—" Alarmed by the look of worry on his pale face, she suddenly broke off. "Why, whatever is the matter?" she asked. She was not used to this kind of thing in visitors. Not that there were many visitors anyhow, or any reason why there should be many visitors. "You're not feeling ill, are you?" He shook his head. "She's my mother," he said in a low voice. The nurse gave him a look of horror, then quickly looked away, her face red and burning with discomfort. "Take me to her," said the savage, making an effort to speak in an ordinary tone. Still very red, she led the way down the room. Linda was lying in the last of the long row of beds. Her eyes were closed. Her pale, swollen face wore a look of stupid happiness. The nurse walked away. The savage sat down beside the bed. "Linda," he whispered, taking her hand. At the sound of her name, she turned. Her eyes opened. A look came into them as if she recognized him. She pressed his hand. She smiled. Her lips moved. Then, quite suddenly, her head fell forward. She was asleep. He sat watching her, remembering with tears in his eyes their life in the reservation, especially all the stories she had told him about the other place, that beautiful, beautiful other place, whose memory, as of a heaven of goodness and loveliness, he kept fresh in his mind, unspoilt by contact with the disappointing reality of this real London, these actual civilized men and women. His thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a group of noisy child visitors who had been brought by the head nurse to see the dying people as part of their conditioning, to get them used to death and dying people. He sent them away angrily from Linda's bedside, but when he sat down again, his feelings and thoughts had changed. Instead of the gentle moments of his childhood, when Linda had been a kind and loving mother to him, he could now remember only the ugly scenes of their life, with Popeye in her bedroom and herself in an ugly sleep after drinking a great deal of mezcal. Linda moved, woke up and smiled, without understanding where she was. "Popey," she whispered, and closing her eyes, she sank back into the covers. "But, Linda," the savage spoke anxiously, "don't you know me?" He pressed her hand again. "Don't you know me?" He felt the faint answering pressure of her hand. The tears came into his eyes. He bent over her and kissed her. Her lips moved. "Popey," she whispered again, and it was to him as though dirt had been thrown in his face. Anger suddenly boiled up in him. Anger at the destruction of his hopes and ideals twice in so short a time, first by Lenina and now by his mother. "But I'm John!" he shouted. "I'm John!" And in his extreme anger and unhappiness, he actually caught her by the shoulder and shook her. Linda's eyes opened again. She saw him, knew him. "John," she whispered. But it was as though she had forgotten how to breathe. A look of terror at his anger came into her eyes. Then her mouth fell open. Her breathing stopped. She was dead. The savage stared at her for a moment in frozen silence, then fell on his knees beside the bed and, covering his face with his hands, cried as though his heart would break. The nurse stood in the middle of the ward, not knowing what to do. The child visitors were staring with wide eyes at this unpleasant scene. Should she speak to him? Try to bring him back to some attempt to behave properly? Remind him of where he was, of what harm he might do to these poor children, upsetting all their well-taught death conditioning with this disgusting behaviour, as though death were something terrible, as though anyone mattered so much as all that. She stepped forward. She touched him on the shoulder. "Can't you behave?" she said in a low, angry voice. But, looking round, she saw that several of the children were coming towards the bed. She must do something to turn their attention away from the savage and his cries. "Now, who wants a piece of chocolate?" she asked in a loud, cheerful voice. "Me!" cried the entire Bokanovsky group with one voice. The savage and his grief were forgotten. "Oh, God, God, God," the savage kept repeating to himself. In the river of sorrow that filled his mind, it was the one word that he was able to say. "God," he whispered it out loud. "God." "Whatever is he saying?" said a voice, very near and distinct, through the sugary music which poured from the loudspeakers. The savage looked round sharply. 5 light-brown twins, each with the end of a stick of chocolate in his right hand, and their faces dirty with chocolate, were standing in a row, all staring at him. As he looked at them, they all smiled. One of them pointed with his bit of chocolate. "Is she dead?" he asked. The savage stared at them for a moment in silence. Then, in silence, he rose to his feet. In silence, slowly walked towards the door. "Is she dead?" repeated the twin, running at his side, wanting to know. The savage looked down at him, and still, without speaking, pushed him away. The twin fell on the floor and at once began to cry. The savage did not even look round. Chapter 14. Realities. The domestic staff of the Park Lane Hospital for the Dying consisted of 162 deltas divided into 2 Bokanovsky groups of 84 red-headed female and 78 dark-haired male twins. At 6, when their working day was over, the 2 groups gathered in the front hall of the hospital and were served by a higher official with their Soma tablets. From the lift, the savage stepped out into the middle of them. But his mind was elsewhere with death, with grief, with his sadness. Without noticing what he was doing, he began to push his way through the crowd. "Who are you pushing? Where do you think you're going?" High, low, from a crowd of separate throats, only 2 voices came. Repeated countless times, as if by a mirror, 2 faces, one red-headed, the other dark-haired, turned angrily towards him. Their words, and in his chest sharp digs from their elbows, brought him to his senses. He woke once more to the real world, looked round him, saw the endless crowd of similar beings around him. Twins, twins. Twins had stared, smiling at the dead Linda. Now, larger, fully grown, they broke into his grief and his lost hope. He stopped and stared at the light brown crowd in the middle of which, taller than it by a full head, he stood. "Oh, brave new world," he said sadly to himself. "Soma distribution!" shouted a loud voice. "In good order! Hurry up there, please!" A door had been opened, a table and chair carried into the front hall. The voice was that of a cheerful young alpha, who had entered carrying a black iron cash box. A low sound of satisfaction went up from the eager twins. They forgot all about the savage. Their attention was now directed at the black cash box, which the young man had placed on the table and was now unlocking. The lid was lifted. "Ooh, ooh," said all the 162 voices in a single cry of joy. The young man took out a handful of tiny boxes of tablets. "Now," he commanded, "step forward, please. 1 at a time and no shoving." 1 at a time, with no shoving, the twins stepped forward. First 2 males, then a female, then another male, then 3 females, then... The savage stood looking on. "Oh, brave new world! Oh, brave new world!" In his mind, the singing words seemed to change their tone. They had laughed at him through his sadness and hopelessness. Now, suddenly, they rang out in a call to action. "Oh, brave new world!" Miranda was telling of the possibility of loveliness, the possibility of changing even the life which surrounded him like a bad dream into something fine and noble. Oh, brave new world! It was a challenge, a command. "No shoving there now!" shouted the official angrily. He shut his cash box noisily. "I shall stop the distribution unless I get good behaviour." The deltas pushed against one another a little, and then were still. His words had had their effect. Loss of Soma, fearful thought. "That's better," said the young man, and reopened his cash box. Linda had been a slave. Linda had died. Others should live in freedom, and the world be made beautiful. And suddenly, it was clear to the savage what he must do. "Now," said the official. Another light brown female stepped forward. "Stop!" called the savage in a loud and ringing voice. "Stop!" He pushed his way to the table. The deltas stared at him with shock. "Ford," said the official below his breath. "It's the savage!" He felt frightened. Listen, I beg you, cried the savage. Lend me your ears. He had never spoken in public before and found it very difficult to express what he wanted to say. Don't take that horrible stuff. It's poison. It's poison. I say, Mr. Savage, said the official with an uncertain smile, would you mind letting me... Poison to soul as well as body. Yes, but let me get on with my distribution, won't you? There's a good fellow. With the fear of one stroking an animal that might bite, he touched the savage's arm. Just let me... Never! Cried the savage. But look here, old man. Throw it all away, that horrible poison. The words, throw it all away, caught the attention of the stupid deltas, made them realize what was happening. An angry cry went up from the crowd. I come to bring you freedom, said the savage, turning back towards the twins. I come... The official heard no more. He had slipped out of the hall and was looking for a number in the telephone book. Not in his own rooms, Bernard said. Not in mine, not at the centre or the college. Where can he have got to? Helmholtz didn't know. They had come back from their work expecting to find the savage waiting for them at one or other of their usual meeting places, and there was no sign of the fellow. This was upsetting their plans. They had meant to go over to Biarritz in Helmholtz's four-seater sportycopter. They'd be late for dinner if he didn't come soon. We'll give him 5 more minutes, said Helmholtz. If he doesn't turn up by then, we'll... The ringing of the telephone bell interrupted him. He picked up the receiver. Hello? Speaking. Then, after a long interval of listening, Oh, Ford, he cried. I'll come at once. What is it? Bernard asked. A fellow I know at the Park Lane Hospital, said Helmholtz. The savage is there. Seems to have gone mad. Anyhow, it's urgent. Will you come with me? Together, they hurried along the corridor to the lifts. But do you like being slaves? The savage was saying as they entered the hospital. His face was red, his eyes bright with passion and anger. Do you like being babies? Yes, babies! Stupid babies all your lives? He added, driven by their animal stupidity into throwing insults at those he had come to save. The insults fell off their thick skins. They stared at him with a blank expression in their eyes. Yes, stupid! He shouted. Grief and hopelessness, pity and duty, all were forgotten now and, as it were, melted into an uncontrollable hatred of these less-than-human beings. Don't you want to be free men? Don't you even understand what it is to be a man and free? Don't you? He repeated, but got no answer to his question. Very well then, I'll teach you. I'll make you free whether you want to or not. And pushing open the window that looked onto the inner court of the hospital, he began to throw the little boxes of Soma tablets out of it in handfuls. For a moment, the light brown crowd was silent, frozen with amazement and horror at the sight of this fearful crime. He's mad, whispered Bernard, staring with wide-open eyes. They'll kill him. They'll... A great shout suddenly went up from the crowd. A wave of movement drove it, threatening, towards the savage. Ford, help him, said Bernard, and turned his eyes away. Ford helps those who help themselves. And with a laugh, actually a laugh of joy, Helmholtz Watson pushed his way through the crowd. Free! Free! The savage shouted. and with one hand continued to throw the soma into the courtyard, while, with the other, he hit out at the indistinguishable faces of his attackers. "Free!" And suddenly there was Helmholtz at his side. "Good old Helmholtz!" also hitting out. "Men at last!" Helmholtz cried, and threw the poison out by handfuls through the open window. "Yes, men! Men! Men!" And there was no more poison left. He picked up the cash box and showed them its black emptiness. "You're free!" Screaming with anger, the Deltas charged. "They're done for," said Bernard, and, with a sudden urge to help them, ran forward, then decided not to and stopped. Then, ashamed, stepped forward again, then decided against it once more, and was standing there ashamed of his own fear, thinking that they might be killed if he didn't help them, and that he might be killed if he did. When, Ford be praised, in ran the police, pig-faced in their gas masks. Bernard rushed to meet them. He waved his arms. And it was action. He was doing something. He shouted help several times more and more loudly so as to persuade himself that he was helping. "Help! Help! Help!" The policemen pushed him out of the way and got on with their work. 3 men with machines on their shoulders pumped thick clouds of soma gas into the air. 2 more were busy with an artificial music box. Carrying water guns loaded with a powerful sleeping gas, 4 others had pushed their way into the crowd and were steadily putting out of action the stronger of the fighters. "Quick! Quick!" screamed Bernard. "They'll be killed if you don't hurry! Oh!" Tired of his shouting, one of the policemen had given him a shot from his water gun. Bernard stood for a second or two on his shaky legs, then fell onto the floor. Suddenly, from out of the artificial music box, a voice began to speak. The voice of reason, the voice of good feeling. The soundtrack roll was unwinding itself in artificial crowd control speech number 2, average strength. Straight from the depths of a heart that had never existed, my friends, said the voice, with a note of such gentle sorrow that, behind their gas masks, even the policemen's eyes were for a moment filled with tears. What is the meaning of this? Why aren't you all being happy and good together? Happy and good, the voice repeated. It trembled, sank into a whisper, and for a moment died away. Oh, I do want you to be happy, it began again. I do so want you to be good. Please, please be good, and 2 minutes later, the voice and the soma gas had produced their effect. In tears, the Deltas were kissing and throwing their arms round one another. 6 twins held each other at a time. Even Helmholtz and the Savage were almost crying. A fresh supply of tablets was brought in from the hospital's stores. The soma was quickly given out, and, to the sound of loving goodbyes from the voice, the twins departed, crying as though their hearts would break. Goodbye, my dearest, dearest friends. Ford keep you. Goodbye, my dearest, dearest friends. Ford keep you. Goodbye, my dearest, dearest. When the last of the Deltas had gone, the policeman turned off the current. The heavenly voice fell silent. Will you come quietly? Asked the sergeant. Or must we put you to sleep? He pointed his water gun. Oh, we'll come quietly, the Savage answered, wiping a cut lip and a bitten left hand. Still keeping his hand to his bleeding nose, Helmholtz nodded in agreement. Awake and able to stand up again, Bernard had chosen this moment to move as quietly as he could towards the door. "Hi, you there!" called the sergeant, and a gas-masked policeman hurried across the room and laid a hand on the young man's shoulder. Bernard turned with an expression of surprise. Escaping? He hadn't dreamed of such a thing. "Though what on earth you want me for?" he said to the sergeant. "I really can't imagine." "You're a friend of the prisoners, aren't you?" "Well," said Bernard, and thought. No, he really couldn't deny it. "Why shouldn't I be?" he asked. "Come on then," said the sergeant, and led the way towards the door and the waiting police car. Chapter 15. In the Service of Happiness. The room into which the three were shown was the controller's study. "His Lordship will be down in a moment." The Gamma manservant left them to themselves. Helmholtz laughed out loud. "It's more like a social gathering than a trial," he said, and let himself fall into the most comfortable of the armchairs. "Cheer up, Bernard," he added, catching sight of his friend's pale, unhappy face. But Bernard would not be cheered. Without answering, without even looking at Helmholtz, he went and sat down on the most uncomfortable chair in the room, carefully chosen with some confused hope of turning away from him the anger of the higher powers. The savage, meanwhile, wandered restlessly round the room, looking without much interest at the books on the shelves, at the soundtrack rolls and the reading machine films in their numbered places. On the table under the window lay a large volume bound in soft black artificial leather and stamped with large golden T's. He picked it up and opened it. My Life and Work, by R. Ford. The work had been published in Detroit by the Society for the Spread of Fordian Knowledge. He turned the pages slowly, read a sentence here, a paragraph there, and had just decided that the book didn't interest him when the door opened and the World Controller for Western Europe walked quickly into the room. Mustafa Mond shook hands with all three of them, but it was to the savage that he addressed himself. "So, you don't much like civilization, Mr. Savage," he said. The savage looked at him. He had been prepared to lie, to argue, to remain rude and silent, but, encouraged by the good-humoured intelligence of the controller's face, he decided to tell the truth, quite frankly. "No." He shook his head. Bernard jumped and looked alarmed. What would the controller think? To be identified as the friend of a man who said that he didn't like civilization, said it openly, and, of all people, to the controller. It was terrible. "But, John," he began. A look from Mustafa Mond reduced him to a frightened silence. "Of course," the savage went on to admit, "there are some very nice things. All that music in the air, for instance. Sometimes 1,000 twangling instruments will hum about my ears, and sometimes voices." The savage's face lit up with a sudden pleasure. "Have you read The Tempest too?" he asked. "I thought nobody knew about those plays here in England." "Almost nobody. I'm one of the very few. It's forbidden, you see. But as I make the laws here, I can also break them. Without being punished, Mr. Marks," he added, turning to Bernard. "Which I'm afraid you can't do." Bernard sank into a hopeless unhappiness. "But why is it forbidden?" asked the savage. In the excitement of meeting a man who had read Shakespeare, he had, for the moment, forgotten everything else. The controller looked at him evenly. Because it's old. That's the main reason. We haven't any use for old things here.
Even when they're beautiful?
Particularly when they're beautiful. Beauty's attractive, and we don't want people to be attracted by old things. We want them to like the new ones.
But the new ones are so stupid and horrible. Those plays where there's nothing but helicopters flying about and people kissing all the time.
He made a face.
Goats and monkeys.
Only in Othello's words could he find satisfactory expression for his feelings of hatred. Nice animals, anyhow, said the controller almost to himself.
Why don't you let them see Othello instead?
I've told you, it's old. Besides, they couldn't understand it. Yes, that was true. He remembered how Helmholtz had laughed at Romeo and Juliet.
Well then, he said after a pause, something new that's like Othello, and that they could understand. Do you see what I mean?
That's what we've all been wanting to write, said Helmholtz, breaking a long silence. And it's what you never will write, said the controller. Because if it were really like Othello, nobody could understand it, however new it might be. And if it were new, it couldn't possibly be like Othello.
Why not?
Yes, why not? Helmholtz repeated. He too was forgetting the unpleasant realities of the situation. Only Bernard, pale with fear and anxiety about the future, remembered them. The others took no notice of him. Why not? Because our world is not Othello's world. You can't write sad stories where there is no unhappiness. The world's peaceful now. People are happy. They get what they want, and they never want what they can't get. They're well off. They're safe. They're never ill. They're not afraid of death. They know nothing of passion and old age. They don't have to worry about mothers and fathers. They've got no wives or children or loved ones to feel strongly about. They're so conditioned that they practically can't help behaving as they ought to behave. And if anything should go wrong, there's Soma, which you go and throw out of the window in the name of freedom, Mr. Savage. Freedom! He laughed. Expecting deltas to know what freedom is, and now expecting them to understand Othello. How can you have such an idea? The savage was silent for a moment.
All the same, he went on, sticking to his argument, Othello's good. Othello's better than those films.
Of course it is, the controller agreed. But that's the price we have to pay for stability. You've got to choose between happiness and what people used to call high art. We've given up the high art. We have the love films instead.
But they don't mean anything.
They mean themselves. They mean a lot of good feelings to the audience.
But they're written by stupid people.
The controller laughed. You're not being very polite to your friend Mr. Watson, one of our most distinguished emotional engineers. But he's right, said Helmholtz, clearly upset. Because it is stupid. Writing when there's nothing to say. Exactly. But that demands the greatest skill. Making something out of practically nothing. The savage shook his head.
It all seems to me quite horrible.
Of course it does. Happiness is never as exciting as unhappiness or the struggles of great passions. Happiness is never grand.
I suppose not,
said the savage after a silence.
But need it be as bad as those twins?
He remembered all those long lines of ugly little twins waiting for their soma, smiling round Linda's deathbed, attacking him in a crowd with one face endlessly repeated. He looked at his bitten hand and trembled.
Horrible!
But how useful! I see you don't like our Bokanovsky groups, but I assure you they're the foundation on which everything else is built. They provide the stability on which the whole social organization depends.
I was wondering, said the savage, why you had them at all, since you can get whatever you want out of those bottles. Why don't you make everybody an Alpha Double Plus?
Mustafa Mond laughed. Because we have no wish to have our throats cut, he answered. We believe in happiness and stability. A society of alphas couldn't fail to be restless and unhappy. An alpha would go mad if he had to do epsilon work, or start destroying things. Only an epsilon can be expected to make epsilon sacrifices, for the good reason that for him, they aren't sacrifices. His conditioning has determined the life he has got to live. He can't help himself. The savage was silent. The ideal population, said Mustafa Mond, is like an iceberg, 8/9 below the waterline, 1/9 above.
And they're happy below the waterline?
Happier than above it. Happier than your friends here, for example. He pointed.
In spite of that awful work?
Awful? They don't find it so. Quite the opposite, they like it. It's light, it's childishly simple. No strain on the mind or the muscles. 7.5 hours of gentle labour without too much bodily effort, and then the soma distribution and games and other amusements provided for them. What more can they ask for? True, he added, they might ask for shorter hours, but would they be any the happier for that? No, they wouldn't. The experiment was tried more than a century and a half ago. The whole of Ireland was put onto the 4-hour day. What was the result? Unrest and a large increase in the amount of soma taken. The Inventions Office is full of plans for labour-saving processes, thousands of them. Mustafa Mond waved his arms as if to give an idea of the great pile of plans. And why don't we use them? For the sake of the workers. It would be cruelty to give them too much leisure. It's the same with agriculture. We could produce every mouthful of food artificially if we wanted to, but we don't. We prefer to keep 1/3 of the population on the land, for their own sakes, because it takes longer to get food out of the land than out of a factory. Besides, we have our stability to think of. We don't want to change. Every change is a threat to stability. That's another reason why we're so careful about using new inventions. Every discovery in pure science could lead to a revolution. Even science must sometimes be treated as a possible enemy. Yes, even science.
What?
Said Helmholtz in amazement.
But we're always teaching people that science is everything. That comes in sleep teaching. 3 times a week between 7 and 13, added Bernard. And all the science propaganda we do at the college.
Yes, but what sort of science? Asked Mustafa Mond. You've had no scientific training, so you can't judge. I was a pretty good scientist in my time. Too good. Enough to realise that all our science is just a cookery book, with an official theory of cooking that nobody's allowed to question, and a list of recipes that mustn't be added to except by special permission from the head cook. I'm the head cook now, but I was once a young kitchen boy with a taste for finding things out. I started doing a bit of cooking on my own. Unofficial cooking. Unlawful cooking. A bit of real science, in fact. He was silent. "What happened?" asked Helmholtz Watson. The controller breathed deeply. "Very nearly what's going to happen to you young men. I was on the point of being sent to an island." Bernard started at these words. "Send me to an island?" He jumped up, ran across the room, and stood waving his arms in front of the controller. "You can't send me. I haven't done anything. It was the others. I tell you, it was the others." He pointed with an accusing finger to Helmholtz and the savage. "Oh, please don't send me to Iceland. I promise I'll do what I ought to do. Give me another chance. Please, give me another chance." The tears began to fall. "I tell you, it's their fault," he cried. "And not to Iceland. Oh, please, your Fordship, please." And in a fit of hopelessness, he threw himself on his knees before the controller. Mustafa Mond tried to make him get up, but he stayed there, crying and protesting. In the end, the controller had to ring for his fourth secretary. "Bring 3 men," he ordered, "and take Mr. Marks into a bedroom. Give him some soma and then put him to bed." The secretary went out and returned with 3 twin attendants in green uniforms. Still shouting and crying, Bernard was carried out. "One would think he was going to have his throat cut," said the controller as the door closed. "If he had any sense, he'd realise that his punishment is really a reward. That's to say, he's being sent to a place where he'll meet the most interesting set of men and women to be found anywhere in the world. All the people who, for one reason or another, are too individual to fit into community life. All the people who aren't content to be the same as the others, who've got independent ideas of their own. Everyone, in a word, who's anyone. I almost wish it were me, Mr. Watson." Helmholtz laughed. "Then why aren't you on an island yourself?" "Because, finally, I preferred this. I was given the choice. To be sent to an island where I could have got on with my scientific work, or to be taken on to the Controller's Council with the certainty of myself becoming a controller. I chose this and let the science go. I've gone on controlling ever since. It hasn't been very good for truth, of course, but it's been very good for happiness. Happiness has got to be paid for. You're paying for it, Mr. Watson. Paying because you happen to be too much interested in beauty. I was too much interested in truth. I paid too." "But you didn't go to an island," said the savage after a long silence. The controller smiled. "That's how I paid, by choosing to serve happiness. Other people's, not mine. It's lucky," he added after a pause, "that there are such a lot of islands in the world. I don't know what we should do without them. Put you all in the gas chamber, I suppose. By the way, Mr. Watson, would you like a tropical climate or something that will keep you more lively?" Helmholtz rose from his armchair. "I should like a thoroughly bad climate," he answered. "I believe one would write better if the climate were bad. If there were a lot of wind and storms, for example." The controller nodded his approval. "I like your spirit, Mr. Watson. I like it very much indeed, as much as I officially disapprove of it." He smiled. "What about the Falkland Islands?"
"Yes, I think that will do," Helmholtz answered. "And now, if you don't mind, I'll go and see how poor Bernard's getting on."
Chapter 16. The New God.
"Art, science, you seem to have paid a fairly high price for your happiness," said the savage when they were alone. "Anything else?"
"Well, religion, of course," replied the controller. "At one time there used to be something called God. But I was forgetting, you know all about God, I suppose."
"Well—"
The savage paused. He would have liked to say something about being alone, about night, about the plain lying pale under the moon, about the fall into shadowy darkness, about death. He would have liked to speak, but there were no words, not even in Shakespeare. The controller, meanwhile, had crossed to the other side of the room and was unlocking a large safe fixed into the wall between the bookshelves. The heavy door swung open. Feeling about in the darkness inside, "It's a subject," he said, "that has always had a great interest for me." He pulled out a thick black volume. "You've never read this, for example?" The savage took it.
"The Holy Bible,"
he read from the title page. "Nor this." It was a small book and had lost its cover.
"The Imitation of Christ."
"Nor this." He picked out another one.
"The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James."
"And I've got plenty more," Mustapha Mond continued, sitting down. "A whole collection of old, forbidden books. God in the safe and Ford on the shelves." He pointed with a laugh to his official library, to the shelves of books, the reading machine films and soundtrack rolls.
"But if you know about God, why don't you tell them?"
asked the savage angrily.
"Why don't you give them these books about God?"
For the same reason as we don't give them Othello. They're old. They're about God hundreds of years ago, not about God now.
"But God doesn't change."
Men do, though.
"What difference does that make?"
All the difference in the world. People used to turn to God when they were growing old and troubled and tired of the world. In the modern world, we've got youth and happiness right up to the end. What follows? Evidently, that we can be independent of God. Religious feeling will make up to us all our losses, says the writer of one of these old books. But we haven't any losses to be made up. We don't need religious feeling.
"Then you think there is no God?"
No, I think there quite probably is one.
"Then why—"
Mustapha Mond cut him short. "But he shows himself in different ways to different men. In the old times, he showed himself as the being that's described in these books. Now—"
"How does he show himself now?"
asked the savage. "Well, he shows himself as if he weren't there at all. Where there is comfort, there is no need for God."
"But I don't want comfort. I want God. I want poetry. I want real danger. I want freedom. I want goodness. I want sin."
"In fact," said Mustapha Mond, "you're claiming the right to be unhappy."
"All right then," said the savage. "I'm claiming the right to be unhappy."
Not to mention the right to grow old and ugly and weak, the right to suffer disease, the right to have too little to eat, the right to live in constant fear of what may happen tomorrow, the right to fall a victim to pains of every kind. There was a long silence.
I claim them all,
said the savage at last. Mustapha Mond spoke slowly. You're welcome, he said. Chapter 17. John Alone. The door was half open. They entered. John! From the bathroom came the unpleasant sound of somebody being violently sick. Is there anything the matter? Helmholtz called. There was no answer. The unpleasant sound was repeated twice. There was silence. Then the bathroom door opened and, very pale, the savage came out. I say, Helmholtz cried anxiously, you do look ill, John. Did you eat something that upset you? Asked Bernard. The savage nodded.
I ate civilization.
What?
It poisoned me. And then, he added in a lower tone, I ate my own evil nature.
Yes, but what exactly... I mean, just now you...
Now I am pure again, said the savage. I drank some salty water.
The others stared at him in surprise. Do you mean to say that you were doing it on purpose? Asked Bernard.
That's how the Indians always make themselves pure.
He sat down and wiped his forehead.
I shall rest for a few minutes, he said. I'm rather tired.
Well, I'm not surprised, said Helmholtz. After a silence, we've come to say goodbye, he went on in another tone. We're off tomorrow morning. Yes, we're off tomorrow, said Bernard, on whose face the savage noticed a new expression of determined acceptance. And by the way, John, he continued, leaning forward in his chair and laying a hand on the savage's knee, I want to say how sorry I am about everything that happened yesterday. His face went red. How ashamed, he went on, in spite of the trembling in his voice. How, really... The savage cut him short and, taking his hand, pressed it in sympathy. Helmholtz was wonderful to me, Bernard went on after a little pause. If it hadn't been for him, I should... Now, Helmholtz protested. There was a silence. In spite of their sadness, because of it even, for their sadness was the sign of their love for one another, the three young men were happy. I went to see the controller this morning, said the savage at last. What for? To ask if I could go to the islands with you. And what did he say? Asked Helmholtz eagerly. The savage shook his head. He wouldn't let me. Why not? He said he wanted to go on with the experiment. But I won't, said the savage with sudden anger. I won't go on being experimented with. Not for all the controllers in the world. I shall go away tomorrow too. But where? The others asked. The savage shook his head. I don't know. Anywhere. I don't care, so long as I can be alone. The helicopter air lane from London to Portsmouth was marked by a line of air lighthouses, which served to guide night flyers. The line from Portsmouth to London ran roughly parallel to it, similarly marked, some distance to the west. At one point, in the county of Surrey, the old lines had been not more than 6 or 7 kilometres apart. The distance was too small for careless flyers, particularly at night and when they had taken 0.5 gram too much. There had been accidents, serious ones. It had been decided to move the Portsmouth-London line a few kilometres further to the west. The course of the old line was marked by 4 deserted air lighthouses. The skies above them were empty and silent. The savage had chosen for his lonely dwelling one of these lighthouses, which stood on the top of a hill. The building was well built and in good condition, almost too comfortable, the savage had thought when he first looked round the place, almost too civilized. But he accepted it by promising himself that he would make his life all the harder, with the severest self-discipline. His first night there was passed without sleep. He spent the dark hours on his knees, praying to all the gods of whom he had heard in his childhood days in the reservation. From time to time he stretched out his arms as though he were on the cross, and held them out until they ached.
"Oh, forgive me,"
he prayed as the tears streamed down his face.
"Oh, make me pure. Oh, help me to be good."
Again and again, till he was on the point of fainting from the pain. When morning came, he felt he had earned the right to live in the lighthouse. Yes, even though there was still glass in most of the windows, even though the view from the platform was so fine. For the very reason for his choosing the lighthouse had become almost immediately a reason for going somewhere else. He had decided to live there because the view was so beautiful, because from that high place he seemed to be looking out on the loveliness of heaven itself. But what right had he to be comforted with the daily and hourly sight of loveliness? All he deserved to live in was some blind hole in the ground. Stiff and still aching after his long night of pain, but feeling comforted because of it, he climbed to the platform of his tower. He looked out over the bright, sunlit land. To the north, the view ended with the long line of hills known as the Hog's Back. In the valley which separated these hills from the sandy hill on which the lighthouse stood, there was a little village with a chicken farm, only 9 floors high. On the other side of the lighthouse, towards the south, the ground fell away in long slopes of rough grass and low bushes to a chain of small lakes. It was this slope that had attracted the savage to the lighthouse. The woods, the open stretches of yellow flowering bushes, the tall trees, the shining lakes, these were beautiful and, to an eye used to the dry wastes of the American desert, amazing. And then the quietness. Whole days passed during which he never saw a human being. The lighthouse was only a quarter of an hour's flight from the Charing T Tower, but the hills of Malpais were hardly more empty than this little spot. The crowds that left London daily left it only to play obstacle golf or tennis. There were no golf clubs in the area. The nearest artificial tennis courts were several miles away. Flowers and scenery were the only attractions here. And so, as there was no good reason for coming, nobody came. During the first few days, the savage lived alone and in peace. Of the money which, on his first arrival, John had received for his personal expenses, most had been spent on equipment that he needed for his new life. He counted his money. The little that remained, he hoped, would be enough to last him through the winter. By next spring, his garden would be producing enough to make him independent of the outside world. Meanwhile, there would always be wild animals. He had seen plenty of rabbits, and there were wild duck on the lakes. He set to work at once to make a bow and arrows. There were young trees, beautifully straight, in a little wood near the lighthouse. He began by cutting down one which gave him 2 meters of straight stem without branches. He took off the outer covering of the tree and then gradually and very carefully cut away the white wood, as old Mitsima had taught him, until he had a strong stick, of his own height, stiff at the centre where it was thickest, lively as a steel spring at the tips. After those weeks in London, with nothing to do, whenever he wanted anything, but to press a switch or turn a handle, it was pure joy to be doing something that demanded skill and patience. He had almost finished shaping the staff when he realized with a shock that he was singing. Singing! He stopped, feeling very guilty. After all, it was not to sing and enjoy himself that he had come here. It was to escape from the disgusting contact with civilized life. It was to be made pure and good. He realized that he had forgotten what he had promised to himself that he would remember. Poor Linda and his own murderous unkindness to her in her last moments. He had come here to show how deep was his sorrow. And here he was, sitting happily making his bow, singing, actually singing. He went inside, opened the box of salt, and put some water on to boil. Half an hour later, 3 Delta- land workers who happened to be driving past were shocked to see a young man standing beside the abandoned lighthouse, naked to the waist and hitting himself with a knotted whip. His back was marked with thin red lines, and between them ran drops of blood. The driver of the lorry stopped at the side of the road and, with his 2 friends, stared open-mouthed at the extraordinary sight. 1, 2, 3, they counted the strokes. After the 8th, the young man interrupted his self-punishment to run to the wood's edge and there be violently sick. When he had finished, he picked up the whip and began hitting himself again. 9, 10, 11, 12. "Ford," whispered the driver, and his twins were of the same opinion. "Fordy," they said. 3 days later, like birds settling on a dead body, the reporters came. Dried and hardened over a slow fire of green wood, the bow was ready. The savage was busy on his arrows. 30 straight sticks had been dried, tipped with sharp nails, and a V-shaped cut carefully made at the other end of each one where the string would fit. He had secretly visited the chicken farm one night and now had enough feathers for all his needs. He was putting feathers on one of his arrows when the first of the reporters arrived. Noiseless on rubber shoes, the man came up behind him. "Good morning, Mr. Savage," he said. "I am the representative of the hourly radio." Taken by surprise, the savage sprang to his feet, as if a snake had bitten him, scattering arrows and feathers in all directions. "I beg your pardon," said the reporter. "I'm sorry." He touched his hat, a tall hat of light metal in which he carried his radio equipment. "Excuse my not taking it off," he said. "It's a bit heavy. Well, as I was saying, I am the representative of the hourly—" "What do you want?" asked the savage angrily. The reporter smiled his most friendly smile. "Well, of course, our readers would be very interested in a few words from you, Mr. Savage." He smiled more pleasantly than ever. "Just a few words from you, Mr. Savage." And in a very few moments he had taken wires from his pocket, connected them to his radio set, and turned it on. "Hello?" he said into a microphone, which the touch of a spring had caused to hang down from his hat and in front of his mouth. A bell suddenly rang inside his hat. "Is that you, Edsel? Primo Melon speaking. Yes, I've managed to find him. He's here. Mr. Savage will now take the microphone and say a few words. Won't you, Mr. Savage? He looked up at the Savage with another of those winning smiles. Just tell our readers why you came here. What made you leave London, hold on Edsel, so suddenly? And of course, that whip. The Savage jumped. How did they know about the whip? And then something about civilization. You know the sort of stuff. What I think of the civilized girl. Just a few words, a very few. The Savage obeyed, but not in the way Mr. Mellon expected. 2 words he spoke, no more, and then repeated them. Get out! He shouted. Get out! And seizing the reporter by the shoulder, he spun him round and, with all the force and skill of a champion football player, kicked him violently on his well-covered bottom. 8 minutes later, a new edition of the Hourly Radio was on sale in the streets of London. Hourly Radio reporter kicked by Mystery Savage, said the headline on the front page. In spite of what Mellon had suffered, 4 other reporters called that afternoon at the lighthouse. Each one was received more violently than the one before. From a safe distance, and still rubbing the sore place where the kick had landed, one of them shouted, You madman! Why don't you take Soma? That would make you feel better. Oh, would it? Said the Savage, picking up a large stick and moving towards him. The reporter made a rush for his helicopter. The Savage was left for a time in peace. A few helicopters came and circled the tower. He shot an arrow into the nearest of them. It went through the light metal floor of the helicopter. There was a cry of pain, and the machine shot up into the air with all the speed and power that its engines could give it. After that, the others kept their distance respectfully. Taking no further notice of them, the Savage dug at what was to be his garden. After a time, they grew tired of waiting, since nothing seemed to be happening, and flew away. The weather was very hot. There was thunder in the air. He had dug all the morning and was resting, stretched out along the floor. And suddenly, Lenina came into his thoughts, as real as if she were there in the lighthouse with him, naked, saying, Darling, and put your arms round me, in shoes and socks and smelling sweet. Shameless woman! But oh, her arms round his neck, her soft red lips, her smooth white skin. Lenina! No. He sprang to his feet and ran out of the house. At the edge of the wood there stood an old bush with needle-like leaves. He threw himself against it. He held closely not the smooth body of his desires, but an armful of sharp green points. They gave him great pain. He tried to think of poor Linda, breathless, silent, with terror in her eyes. Poor Linda, whom he had promised to remember. But it was still the presence of Lenina that filled his mind. Lenina, whom he had promised to forget. Even through the sting of the bush he could feel her, unavoidably real. Sweet, sweet. And if you wanted me too, why didn't you? The whip was hanging on a nail by the door, ready for use should any more reporters arrive. In anger, the Savage ran back to the house, seized it, swung it in the air. The knots bit into his flesh. Whore! Whore! He shouted at every blow, as though it were Lenina, and how greatly, without knowing it, he wished it were. White, warm, sweet-smelling, shameless Lenina that he was whipping thus. Shameless! And then, desperately, Oh, Linda, forgive me. Forgive me, God. I'm bad. I'm evil. No, you whore! You whore! From his carefully built hiding place in the wood 300 metres away, Darwin Bonaparte, the television corporation's most expert big-game photographer, had watched the whole scene. Patience and skill had been rewarded. He had spent 3 days sitting inside the trunk of an artificial tree, 3 nights moving around on his stomach through the long grass, hiding equipment in bushes, burying wires in the soft grey sand. 72 hours of the greatest discomfort. But now the great moment had come. The greatest, thought Darwin Bonaparte as he moved among his equipment. The greatest since his exciting film of the monkey's wedding. "Wonderful," he said to himself as the savage began his amazing performance. "Wonderful!" He kept his long-distance cameras carefully aimed at the savage, adjusted the settings to get a close-up of the face, twisted with anger and pain. Admirable! Changed for half a minute to slow motion, a really amusing effect, he promised himself. Listened meanwhile to the blows, the cries, the wild and mad words that were being recorded on the soundtrack at the edge of his film. Was very happy to hear, in a quiet moment, the singing of a wild bird. Wished the savage would turn round so that he could get a good close-up of the blood on his back. And, almost immediately, what amazing luck! The savage did turn round, and he was able to take a perfect close-up. "Well, that was great," he said to himself when it was all over. "Really great." He wiped his face with a cloth. When they had finished with it at the studio, it would be a wonderful film. 12 days later, The Savage of Surrey was being shown in every first-class cinema in Western Europe. The effect of Darwin Bonaparte's film was immediate and enormous. On the afternoon which followed the evening of its first performance, the peace of John's lonely home was suddenly broken by the arrival overhead of a great cloud of helicopters. He was digging in his garden, digging, too, in his own mind, thinking of death. Death. And he drove in his spade once, and again, and yet again. "And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death." He lifted another spadeful of earth. Why had Linda died? Why had she been allowed to become gradually less than human, and at last... He trembled. At that point, the sky grew dark. He was suddenly in shadow. There was something between the sun and him. He looked up in surprise from his digging, from his thoughts, and saw, close above him, the cloud of machines hanging in the air. They came like harmful insects, stopped in the air over his head for a moment, then dropped all around him in the long grass and among the bushes. And from the bodies of these huge insects stepped men in white artificial woolen trousers, women in artificial cotton shorts and artificial silk shirts, one couple from each. In a few minutes there were dozens of them, standing in a wide circle round the lighthouse, staring, taking photographs, throwing nuts and sweets as if at an animal in a zoo. And every moment, coming in from all sides in a never-ending stream, their numbers grew and grew. The savage had gone back into his house, and now, like an animal trapped by the hunters, stood with his back to the wall of the lighthouse, staring from face to face in speechless horror, like a man out of his senses. "Go away!" he shouted. The animal had spoken. The crowd laughed and waved their hands. "Good old savage! Hurrah! Hurrah!" And through the noise he heard cries of, "Whip! Whip! The whip!" The words stung him to action. He seized the knotted whip from its nail behind the door and shook it at them. They shook with laughter. He advanced towards them, a terrible figure. A woman cried out in fear. The line of people moved back a little, then stood firm. The thought that they were there in great numbers gave them a courage which the savage had not expected. "Why don't you leave me alone?" There was a suggestion of tears in his anger. "What do you want with me?" he asked, turning from one stupid, smiling face to another. "The whip!" answered 100 voices in one shout. "Let's see you do the whipping act!" Then all together, slowly and heavily, "We want the whip!" shouted a group at the end of the line. "We want the whip!" Others at once took up the cry, and the phrase was repeated again and again, more and more loudly, until no other word was being spoken. "We want the whip!" At this moment, yet another helicopter arrived. When it landed, the door opened and out stepped first a red-faced young man, then, in green artificial cotton shorts, white shirt and smart cap, a young woman. At the sight of the young woman, the savage turned pale and fell back. The young woman stood, smiling at him, an uncertain smile, a smile intended to calm him. The seconds passed. Her lips moved. She was saying something, but the sound of her voice was drowned by the shouts of the crowd. "We want the whip! We want the whip!" The young woman pressed both hands to her left side, and on that face of hers, with its childlike prettiness, appeared an unusual expression of sadness. Her blue eyes seemed to grow larger, brighter, and suddenly 2 tears rolled down her cheeks. Her mouth moved again, though her words could not be heard. Then, with a quick movement of passion, she stretched out her arms towards the savage and stepped forward. "We want the whip! We want—" And all of a sudden, they had what they wanted. "Shameless!" The savage had rushed at her like a madman, striking her violently with his whip. She had turned to run from him in terror, had caught her foot in the roots of the bushes, and had fallen on her face in the long grass. "Henry! Henry!" she shouted. But her red-faced friend had run away and hidden behind the helicopter. The crowd rushed towards the spot where the savage stood, striking at that soft body lying in the grass. "Oh, the flesh! The flesh!" This time it was on the savage's own shoulders that the whip came down. Drawn by the strange attraction of the horror of pain, and driven on by that desire to act as all others acted, that their conditioning had rooted in them, they began to imitate his violent action, striking at one another as the savage struck at his own flesh, or at that shapely, shameless body twisting and turning in pain in the grass at his feet. "Kill it! Kill it! Kill it!" the savage went on shouting. Then suddenly somebody started orgy-porgy, and in a moment they had all caught up the tune and, singing, had begun to dance. Orgy-porgy, round and round and round, beating one another in time to the song. Orgy-porgy! It was after midnight when the last of the helicopters took its flight. Stupid with soma and tired out from endless uncontrolled hours of passion, the savage lay sleeping in the rough grass. The sun was already high when he woke. He lay for a moment, then suddenly remembered everything. "Oh, my God! My God!" He covered his eyes with his hand. That evening the sky was black with helicopters making their way across the sky to the lighthouse in an endless stream. The description of last night's events had been in all the papers. "Savage!" called the first arrivals as they stepped down from their machine. "Mr. Savage!" There was no answer. The door of the lighthouse stood half open. They pushed it wide open and walked into the low light inside. Through a doorway on the other side of the room, they could see the bottom of the stairs that led up to the higher floors. Just under the top of the doorway hung a pair of feet. "Mr. Savage!" Slowly, very slowly, like two unhurried compass needles, the feet turned towards the right. North, northeast, east, southeast, south, south-southwest. Then paused, and, after a few seconds, turned as unhurriedly back towards the left. South-southwest, south, southeast, east.